Hello, my name's Aviva, and today I wanted to give you some book recommendations based off of some other books. So I kind of chose a handful of books that I feel like I see on my feed all the time, more popular books that I feel like you might have read before, and I'm going to match it with another book that you might not have heard of before. So, one way or another, if you've read one of the books and you enjoyed it, then hopefully you will enjoy the other book that I'm matching it with. I've actually done this video on my channel before a couple of months ago, and you guys seem to have really enjoyed it. So I'm kind of doing a part two. I have a whole new set of matchups, and there are a couple of overlaps, but anything that was mentioned in my previous video, I have a new matchup for it in this video. So with that said, let's get into the books. But if you did miss that first video, it will be linked in the description below. And also, if you can give this video a like and subscribe before we get started, because I would appreciate it. But with that said, the first book I wanted to share with you is actually Things We Never Got Over by Lucy Hale, which is a book that I read the other day. And the entire time I was reading it, I'm like, this feels like another book that I also recently read. So it was like perfect timing to make this video. But basically, this is a book that I feel like I've been seeing on my feed pretty recently, kind of like all over the place. I feel like it's a new release, but honestly, I don't know. But anyway, I feel like people are kind of pretty interested in it. So I read it for you guys. It was a pretty cute read. If you're not familiar with what it's actually about this girl who is a runaway bride. She was running away from her wedding, and at the same time, she gets a call from her estranged twin sister saying that she needs help. So she decides to, go and meet up with her sister, and then her sister ends up robbing her and leaving her with an 11-year-old niece that she never knew she had. So now she's stuck in this small town with a girl and no money, no car, nothing, and she doesn't know what to do. And then she runs into this guy named Knox, who basically just butts into her business and can't help but keep on helping her out. So they're gonna just have, a cute small town romance. He is a grump with tattoos and a beard. She is a sunshine, so it's a grumpy sunshine situation. They're gonna end up becoming neighbors, and they're gonna end up working together. And it's a pretty cute, all around the board, fun story. And when I was reading this, the only thing I was able to think about was Juniper Hill by Devney Perry, because it's literally like a carbon copy of themselves. This book is basically about this girl who is a new mom. She has a 2-month-old baby, and she had just run away from her family. She was like a New York City socialite, and she had to get away. So she decides to move to this small town, and she gets a job as a housekeeper for this hotel. And she ends up moving in with the chef that happens to own the hotel. Well, he doesn't own the hotel. His family owns the hotel. And she basically needed a place to stay because it's a tiny town and there's nowhere to rent a place. So she ends up, renting a room from this guy who happens to work at the hotel also. And his name is Knox. He's got a beard and tattoos, and he's a grump. And he can't help but butt himself into her business. So they're working together, they're neighbors, he can't help but get involved in her life, and she is a single mom. Does that sound familiar? I think it does, because it's literally what I just said in this book. So if you enjoyed reading one of these books, then I very, very much think you are going to enjoy reading the other one. But besides for these two books, I actually have one more book I want to just tack onto this matchup, and that is Wait for It by Mariana Zapata. So this is about a single mom who has recently become a mom, and she had taken over guardianship for her 2 nephews when her brother died. And she just moves into this new neighborhood where she meets her neighbor who is a grump, and they're going to end up just having a very slow burn romance. He just gets involved in their life. He can't help but butt himself into their business, and they're going to have a romance. So it's very, very similar to Things We Never Got Over, because, they're not necessarily like mothers from birth, but they have taken over guardianship from their siblings' children, if that makes sense. And then they're going to end up having a romance with their neighbors. So all 3 of these books, very, very similar. Highly recommend reading the other ones if you have read one and enjoyed it, if that makes sense. Next, I wanted to give you a match for The Love Hypothesis by Ali Hazelwood. So this is a very popular book. I'd be surprised if you haven't seen it before. It was literally the #1 book on TikTok last year. But basically, if you're not familiar with it, it is a fake dating scenario between these 2 people who are both scientists. One's a professor and one is a PhD student. They have a fake dating scenario, and obviously they'll end up falling for each other. And when I was reading this, when I was reading this, I kept thinking about this. This is a new release. It came out in the beginning of March, and it's A Brush with Love by Maisie Eddings. And this is basically about these two people who are both dentist students. So the girl is a senior. She's trying to become like, a dental surgeon, and she's very studious. She has all these plans for after graduation, and she happens to literally bump into this freshman in dentist school who's having a really hard time in like his classes and everything like that. And they're basically going to end up like, becoming friends. They obviously very much like each other, and he kind of like tries asking her out, but like she friend zones him because she doesn't want to like mess with any of her after graduation plans sort of thing. So it's kind of like a friend zone situation. And when you think about that, it doesn't really sound very much like The Love Hypothesis, but like the setting of both of these books, the fact that like they're like dentists versus scientists, and it's both in like an academic setting, and they're both like rom-coms, like, regularly published feeling sort of like, vanilla cutesy rom-coms. I just think that like if you enjoyed one, you'll enjoy the other. Like the whole time I was reading this book, I'm just like, I feel like people who like The Love Hypothesis is going to like this book. Like I just thought that over and over when I was reading A Brush with Love. So if you've read one and you enjoyed it, read the other one. Just take my word for it. Next, I wanted to share November 9 by Colleen Hoover, which again is a very popular book. I'd be surprised if you haven't seen it around before. But in case you haven't, I'll quickly tell you what it's about. It's basically about these two people who they meet one day, they really hit it off, they really liked each other, but the girl is about to move across the country, and they're honestly pretty young. I think they're like 19 or so they don't really want to start a relationship or anything like that. So they decide to make this pact where they're going to meet every single year on the same exact day and just catch up. And if after a couple of years they still want to be together, then they will be. So you kind of get to follow their friendship / relationship, or whatever you want to call it, through the years, like 4 or 5 years, every single day on November 9th when they meet. They don't talk in the middle of the year. They don't look each other up on social media, anything along those lines. And happens to be this girl, she is a fire victim. So she has a lot of scars all over her body. She's very self-conscious about it. And this guy is one of the first people to really help her crack out of her shell and feel confident again. And happens to be when I was reading Playing with Fire by LJ Shen, I could only keep thinking about November 9. So Playing with Fire is very similar. You have this girl who is a fire victim. She has scars all over her body. She's extremely self-conscious about it. And she ends up becoming friends with this guy that is in her college that she ends up working with. So it's like this forced proximity. They're working in a food truck together, and he kind of just helps her feel good about herself again. They end up having a friendship, and then obviously a romance is going to bloom. And just happens to be like, if you've read Colleen Hoover books before, then you know that there's always like this twist and turn at the end that like you kind of never saw coming, and it's like gonna break your heart, it's gonna mend it, it's gonna do like weird things to you, if you know what I mean. And happens to be this book had a very similar ending. I'm obviously not going to tell you what it was because I don't want to spoil anything. But basically, if you enjoy November 9 and you like that like Colleen Hoover feeling, then I highly recommend reading Playing with Fire, because for more ways than just the ending, these books are so freaking similar. Next, I wanted to share the Mindfuck series by St. Abbey, which is basically a Criminal Minds episode in a book. You're following this serial killer who is out to get revenge on a handful of people who have wronged her in her past. I highly recommend looking up trigger warnings because this book does get very dark and twisted at times. And she ends up having a relationship with the FBI agent who is on her case trying to find her. So he is a profiler, FBI agent, and he is hunting down the person that he is currently falling in love with. It is a very good book. It's technically 5 novellas like binded up into one very large book, but I feel like it very much reads as just like one good book. So I mean, anyway, it's very good. It was very popular for like 2 weeks straight, like a month or two ago, and I feel like just everybody read it. It wasn't even like a new release. Like this was an old book that for some reason just like trended on TikTok. Everybody read it, got obsessed with it, and then I never really heard another book that is similar to it in case you very much enjoyed it. But I happen to have thought that There Are No Saints, the duet by Sophie Lark, it's like There Are No Saints and then There Is No Devil, is very similar to this book. So in this book, you're following a serial killer who ends up getting extremely obsessed with this starving artist and ends up stalking her and ends up having a relationship with her. So he is a very, professional artist. Like he is a very famous artist, and he ends up like taking this girl under his wing, and they're gonna end up having, a relationship. He's an actual serial killer, and it's a very interesting story. I don't want to give anything away, but my point is that it's really good. Got very stalkerish vibes, very like possessive, overwhelming, crazy stuff goes on in this book. And I just think that if you liked the serial killer aspect in this book, then I think you're you're gonna like this one because at the end of the day, both of the villains win. You kind of get that feeling of like, oh, well, how am I siding with a serial killer somehow? Like I kind of see where they're coming from. It's a twisted ride, and I just think that if you've read one and you enjoyed it and you haven't read the other one yet, then you really should. So while we're on the topic of like dark and twisted books, I wanted to share Hooked by Emily McIntyre, which is a dark and twisted Peter Pan retelling. You're basically following Hook, who wants to get revenge on Peter because Peter used to be business partners with his parents and he ended up like murdering them. So obviously he wants to get revenge on Peter. And the way that he does that is by seducing Peter's daughter named Wendy. So it kind of has like this kidnapping, dark mafia-esque vibe. Like, you know, these guys are basically like in gangs, they're dealing with drugs, like guns, things along those lines. And it's just like a dark and twisted Peter Pan retelling, but in a very like good and like steamy way. And anyway, when I was reading this book, I very much thought of A Stolen Heir by Sophie Lark, which is a Beauty and the Beast retelling in a mafia setting. This is the second book in the Brutal Birthright series. And in this book, you're following this guy who is the head of a mafia, and he ends up kidnapping, you know, a different mafia's daughter to go and get revenge on them for something that they did in the previous book. So it's kind of like, you know, a kidnapping Stockholm Syndrome romance, but it does have like a Beauty and the Beast like vibe going on to it. Like it's very much a Beauty and the Beast retelling. So that is why I thought of Hooked, because this was like a Peter Pan retelling. They both have kidnapping scenarios going on to it, and they're obviously like both gonna fall in love, even though like, you know, the guy kidnapped her. So whatever, for a lot of reasons, I felt like, you know, these books were pretty similar in a different way. But my point is like, if you liked one, I really do think you're gonna like the other. So I recommend checking one or the other out depending on which one you've read. And if you haven't read either, I recommend checking both out. Next, I wanted to share Punk 57 by Penelope Douglas, which again, very popular book. I'd be surprised if you haven't seen it around before. It has been on my feed for like 2 years straight. I feel like people just really like this book. If you're not familiar with it, it's basically about these two people who have been pen pals since they were like little kids. Their classes had set them up and they've been like best friends through letters for years. And one day they're both at a party and this guy meets this girl and realizes that this is his pen pal, and she doesn't recognize him, but he realizes who he's looking at and he doesn't like what he sees. So he gets very mad at her. He stops writing her letters, and then a couple of months later he ends up like showing up at her school and basically like bullying the hell out of her. So it's a very big bully romance with like this pen pal underlying thing of like, I know who you are, but you don't know who I am sort of situation. And it's pretty solid. I feel like Penelope Douglas writes on this line of like making you uncomfortable, but at the same time, like you don't want to put it down. And that's very much how I felt about this book. Like, I'm not really sure how I feel about it because like, was I okay with the amount of bullying that happened in this book? I'm not sure, but at the same time, I couldn't put it down while I was reading it. So with that said, another book that I felt exactly the same way about was Corrupt by Penelope Douglas. I mean, it makes sense because it's both by the same author, but in this book, you're basically following this group of guys. They're the Four Horsemen, and they're basically out to get revenge on this girl who had sent them to jail a couple of years ago. Now that they're out of jail, they're out to basically ruin this girl's life, and they literally do. I'm not even gonna get into the things that they do to this girl, but the bullying in this book is literally next level. And the whole time I was reading this, I'm just like, I don't know if I'm okay with this. Like, this is next level, not okay. But at the same time, like, I couldn't put it down for some reason. So I really do think that if you liked the bullying aspect in this book, then you're gonna absolutely love Corrupt, which is the first book in the Devil's Night series. So for more reasons than I just even pointed out, like, I really do think that these books are super similar. And if you haven't read one, then you should read the other one. But also, just fun fact, these books both take place in the same universe. So if you do read one of them, then you're gonna end up seeing some Easter eggs and like character overlaps in the other one. So, you know, just something fun to look out for. Next, I wanted to share Collided by Lauren Asher, which is the second book in the Dirty Air Companion series. In this series, you're following Formula One race car drivers as they basically have a romance. Every book is like a different scenario. It happens to be in this book, you're following this guy who is an F1 driver, and he ends up having a relationship with the opposite, like, you know, team's coach's daughter. So it's like a forbidden relationship. It's a very cute romance, yada, yada, yada. And happens to be, I think that it is very similar to The Risk by Elle Kennedy, which is the second book in the Briar U series, which is the spin-off series from the Off Campus series. And in this book, you are following college hockey players, and happens to be this whole series is like based out of Briar U, and the Briar U hockey coach's daughter ends up having a forbidden romance with an opposite team's like hockey player. So I think that the guy's from like Harvard or something, and basically they're gonna have one of those relationships. So, you know, both of these books have that forbidden I'm dating, the opposite, like, team's coach's daughter sort of vibe. And I just feel like they're very similar. Like if you enjoyed the setup for one of these books, I really think you're going to like the other one. But this one's hockey. This is Formula One race car drivers, but they're both sports romances. They're both really good. They're both part of companion series. And all around the board, I just think that if you enjoyed one, you're going to like the other. And the last books that I wanted to share with you is The Stopover by T.L. Swan matched up with Boss Man by V. Keelan. So both of these books are workplace environment romances between the boss of this very big company having a relationship with one of the workers. So both of these men are like, the arrogant boss man. I'm wearing a suit. I'm really good looking. I could have anyone that I want, but, I don't want anyone but the person that is working for me sort of vibes. Obviously, they're both set up in different ways, but I feel like they both give off such similar vibes. Like obviously you're both in the same setting, you both have like the same type of male lead and then a very similar woman's character sort of vibe. And it's a workplace environment, they're all like basically the same, but I just think that like both of these books, while they're not set up the same way, they just are very similar and gave off similar vibes. And if you've read one, then I really do think you should check out the other, because I have a feeling you're gonna like it. Take my word for it. I know that this wasn't like a huge explanation of books, but what more do you need to know? It takes place in a workplace. You've got this hot guy in a suit who's very wealthy. He's gonna have a relationship with one of his workers. Done deal. But anyway, with that said, that's all the books that I wanted to share with you. I hope that you found some good recommendations in this video. Let me know if you enjoyed it. Again, if you did, give this video a like, and again, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. But with that said, thank you so much for watching. I'm gonna go, so until next time, enjoy reading.